Okay, good evening, esteemed speakers and those who join us today. This is the second panel of the Regional Visions of the Gulf States program, jointly organized by DİPAM Istanbul and Gulf State Analytics, Washington, D.C. Last week's panel shed light upon Saudi Arabia's regional policies, and this evening we will be focusing on United Arab Emirates. I am Esra ALBAYRAKOİDLU, Associate Professor at Bahçeşehir University, Turkey, and Senior Analyst at DİPAM, and I will be moderating this evening's discussion. Right now, I'm very delighted to have our three distinguished speakers with us. And let me begin with Ambassador Selim KARAOSMANOİDLU. Graduated from Ankara University, Mr. KARAOSMANOİDLU joined the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1970. Serving as Deputy Chief of Mission in the Netherlands and Japan, Chargé d'Affaires in Libya and Vatican, and Ambassador in Abu Dhabi, Tehran, and Baghdad. He has participated as invited speaker at Chatham House, CSIS, and Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow, among others. Retired from the ministry in 2011, he is currently affiliated with SITREP Advisors as senior partner. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the webinar and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We also have here Dr. Khaled Al-MEZAINI as Assistant Professor at Zayed University. He received his PhD in 2009 from the University of Exeter. He was a research associate at Cambridge, visiting professor at Sciences Po, visiting research fellow at LSE, and he also worked as assistant professor at Qatar University. His publications, research, and teaching interests include UAE foreign policy, as well as international relations and political economy of the Gulf in general. Mr. Al-MEZAINI, welcome, and we are delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Next, we have another seasoned analyst, Robert Mogelniki. He is currently affiliated with the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, D.C. as resident scholar. An expert in the political economy of the MENA region, he previously served as senior analyst with the Civic Group and head of public relations and marketing at Oxford Strategic Consulting. Prior to his consulting career, he worked as a journalist covering developments in post-revolutionary Egypt and Tunisia. His commentaries have appeared in prominent outlets like Foreign Policy, Bloomberg, Reuters, among others. So welcome to the webinar, Mr. Mogelniki.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, all right. So we shall begin our discussion, and I will start with Mr. Ambassador, if I may. So, Mr. Ambassador, very generally speaking, how should we interpret the UAE's foreign policy for the next few years, in the past few years? Also, it seems that Abu Dhabi has taken a rather proactive approach when it comes to regional conflicts, sometimes to the dismay of its time-honored ally, Saudi Arabia. So what is your take on this?
Well, let me introduce myself a bit further. Please. I was ambassador in Abu Dhabi between 2004-2008, before I was transferred to Tehran, across the bay, let's say, or the Gulf. I shouldn't say Gulf, because with respect to Al-MEZAINI, I should say the Khalij Arabi. So anyway, during my time, that period, Turkey had excellent relations with the United Arab Emirates, and we had excellent relations with the leadership, because it was the legacy of Sheikh Zayed, who was propagating during his rule good relations with Turkey. I maintain, well, the leadership in the Emirates maintained a similar approach. Now, we, with due respect, when we analyze the United Arab Emirates, there are two factors which affects their policy. Or let's say, maybe I should rephrase it as their threat perception. One is the presence of Iran across the Bay. The other is demographic structure and the traditions of the country. But when we come with the so-called Arab Spring, relations with Turkey had become a bit sore after 2010, because Turkey was supporting or propagating or giving hand to the Arab Spring through Ikhwan Muslimin. And then the reaction of the Emirates was rather harsh. And then we had this very good relations deteriorated rapidly. Now, this is not your question. Your question is how the things are going now in the present time. Forget about Turkey bilateral relations. Now, recently we have seen a shift in the United Arab Emirates foreign policy, and there are various reasons regarding this shift. They have a softer approach to Turkey. They are looking forward to establish better relations. They embrace back Al Thani family and Qatar, and they also bail out from Yemen, the military. I'm not going why they left or switch. I shouldn't say switch, but I'm not going into details of the forces behind what made them to shift their policy in Yemen. But it's a fact. They are bailing out. And we see also a change of policy regarding Libya. I'm not going to say why it was, because there are two things. I think the leadership in Abu Dhabi, because the decisions are made in Abu Dhabi. Of course, other Emirates have some concerns about this or that. I'm not going into detail, because withdrawal of Yemen and the United Arab Emirates, rather regional assertiveness along with Saudi Arabia didn't pay back. Secondly, the economic elements, the economic changes because of COVID has effect in the Emirates change of policy. And the third thing is that maybe this is or the fourth thing is that the United Arab Emirates decided to put its candidacy for the 2020-2024 for the Security Council membership. These factors decided that they should look another path. Let's get well along with Qatar, and which they have done, and let's have a dialogue with Turkey again, which they were, because they were. I'm not going to argue which is right or not. They were accusing Turkey that Turkey is interfering Arab affairs beyond its reach, whereas I can answer as a Turk what they are doing in the Eastern Mediterranean by deploying their aircraft just to irritate Turkey. But this is the past. Now, there is one thing that's my purse, because I'm not working for the Turkish Foreign Ministry anymore. I'm not a civil servant. I'm a simple retired person doing some farming. So I can say that behind this, how should I say, putting salt on the wound is Egypt, because Egypt doesn't want Turkey to have any dominant place, A, in the Arab world, B, in the region, C, in the Eastern Mediterranean, though we are having dialogue also. Now, if I should criticize Turkish foreign policy, we shouldn't have harsh words. We shouldn't have these harsh words against the United Arab Emirates when they established diplomatic relations with Israel, because we are going to upgrade. We are at one stage, or maybe near future, we are going to upgrade our relations with Israel. That was the harshest attack to Turkey. I'm not going to statements made by Mr. Gargash or the deputy foreign minister. Still he doesn't matter. Or Mr. Oteiba in Washington. Well, probably he got that hint, something like this. Now, so I would say that Abu Dhabi is refocusing its methods and making a new risk assessment. And well, the other thing, which is another thing which Abu Dhabi did something positive, is that they have a dialogue with Tehran regarding the Gulf security. This is very important, because I'm not going into Tehran, Iran, the Iranian so-called threat and position, but that you have, if you live in the Gulf, you have to get well along with Iran. That's a fact. And there are other reasons behind this, why they have this dialogue with Iran, which I'm not going into. It's a domestic issue in Dubai, things like this, trade, etc., etc. Because the trade with Iran or trade through United Arab Emirates has been a money-generating activity. But now, next year, they say the growth in the United Arab Emirates will be 1.6. If Iran is a threat, if there's a conflict in the Gulf, what will happen to tourism? What will happen to the major income for Dubai? I mean, yes, Dubai. And what will become the oil prices, things like this. So, well, I'll just stop here. If there are other questions or inputs, then I'm not going to interview. But I was a bit superficial, I know, but just to remind certain points, I was telling, we can go in detail if needed. Thank you.
Sure, Ambassador. Definitely, it was a very insightful introduction. Thank you. And what's your take on this, Dr. Al-MEZAINI? Do you think that the United Arab Emirates is bent on declaring its own regional leadership at the expense of Saudi Arabia's friendship?
Thank you very much, Esra. And I'm glad to hear also, Mr. Ambassador, the factors he discussed in regards to the threat perception. It is very important to know that UAE's foreign policy in the last 10 years have significantly changed if we compare to the period before that. There are many regional changes that require an update and adaptation to the regional changes. And even prior to 2010, with some issues related to the...
I can't hear.
I can't hear. Khaled, we cannot hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, good.
All right, okay. Sorry, I will just... Yeah, it was unmuted for some reason. Mic was not working. Okay. Just wanted to say that in response to the discussion by Mr. Ambassador Selim and he raised the first two factors of threat perception for UAE, Iran and the demographic imbalance. Of course, there are external threats and there are internal threats. Prior to 2010, UAE had been focusing to a great extent on very small issues in the region, not putting so much of its weight in different parts of the focus was economic development, internal issues. Of course, security dimension was extremely important. But demographic imbalance, of course, is important, Mr. Ambassador. However, I think threats that have developed over 20 or 30 years from, this is the state's perception, from transnational threats of particular groups. And it happened to be that members affiliated to Muslim Brotherhood, for example, have been operating in the UAE in different areas. So the state have perceived that as a serious threat prior to 2010 and have not taken that out of their calculation. And they have been, being here in the region, one would see to a great extent the activities of different parts of Muslim Brotherhood in different sectors. This has pushed the state to take further measures against this group because they have seen that this is a security threat toward the stability of the regime, I have to say here. Why? Because those who have signed and agreed with this group is that their main target was the regime. And here is the issue that also many people have probably have not realized to the extent. Some people say that there is an exaggeration from the UAE in regards to the perception of threat from non-state actors like Muslim Brotherhood. So this it was a natural development from the state to take measures at the external level. And we have seen here that after 2010, the rise of the UAE, simultaneously with what happened in the region, with the rising conflict in different parts of the Middle East, where UAE decided to intervene or to take a role in Yemen or in Syria and in North African countries. And this is a very much a clear example of a neo-realist state, or approach, where small state with middle power capabilities, that I call it, wants to intervene and extend some kind of influence because of various security objectives that it sees in the region. So from 2010 until 2020, there has been a significant transformation of UAE foreign policy. Slowly, 2010-11, playing more of a soft power and then moving more into a hard power. And this has also received significant criticism from the regional and international community, that why a small state with limited military capabilities would decide to intervene in different parts of the region. Of course, one would see very difficult because of the size. And here is a question of the perception towards the size of the state. Is it a small power or is it a middle power? And if we perceive this country as a small power, one would say that it will play a limited role in the region. However, the transformation of UAE over the past 10 years or 15 years had taken the level of the UAE from a small power to a small state with a middle power capability. So it has the ability to engage further in the region. So this transformation in UAE's foreign policy have led it to take sometimes leading roles. The coalition with Saudi Arabia playing a role in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, in the Horn of Africa. All of these areas have been of a great interest for the government of the UAE. Now the question is that why the UAE decided to, or not decided, but it happened that it had clash with some countries in the region. And this is the problem, probably what Mr. Ambassador have also raised, is the question of Turkey. I think the transformation also of the development of the relationship between Turkey and UAE has, it's unfortunately, the last couple of years in particular, have clearly seen that UAE and Turkey are the two countries now having a proxy war in Libya, for example, and now acceleration of some activities in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Now UAE have, since 2010, have seen the rise of groups that perceive as threats towards its own security, and then therefore decided to play a role. And this role has been extended to side with particular governments in the region that can confront the rise of Muslim Brotherhood. So here is the issue that where we see in Libya in particular, that UAE with its allies, no, not saying that UAE alone playing this role, we see UAE and its allies against Turkey and its allies in a proxy war, trying to achieve objectives. I think, in my point of view, the objective of two countries. The objective is Turkish foreign policy and UAE's foreign policy. This has been accelerated, which led also, which I think, in my point of view, that also encouraged the UAE to establish further security cooperation in the region, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Consequently, led also to the establishing of diplomatic relations with Israel. One would say, well, it has to do with the Palestinian question, but in my point of view, the acceleration of the tension in the eastern part of the Mediterranean is due to many factors, but also UAE wanted to establish relations with Israel because of the position of the Israel towards different issues in the region. The perception towards Israel, toward Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, and north part of it. So it's a combination of factors that have led the UAE to make some changes in its foreign policy in the last 10 years that required also UAE to surprise many analysts, to be honest, that why would a small state like that would behave in towards the, for example, Turkey, you know, in comparison to the size and military capabilities. However, what we see is that coalition or partnership with Cyprus, with Greece and Israel is going, unfortunately, or might contribute to some kind of instability, because Turkey is already having some conflict with these countries in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And also, what Mr. Ambassador have discussed on the, you know, the assertive foreign policy. I think UAE wants to prove that its objectives or its foreign policy has a clear objective and strategies in the region, which has been trying to achieve. Of course, there are some conflicts like in Yemen, led the UAE to withdraw for other reasons. For example, the bombing of oil tanks in the Gulf that encouraged the UAE to speed up the process of withdrawal. So there are many other factors that led UAE to take some shifts and changes. Now, with 2020, 21, I think we might see also a new kind of changes into UAE's foreign policy under Biden's administration nowadays, already putting pressure on different countries in the region. This is probably a topic that we can talk about later on, but also
definitely, this is definitely a specific question that'll come to you.
Yes, we will talk about it then, and I will stop here. Yeah.
Just take a breath.
Yes.
Thank you for all these essential details. Robert, would you like to add anything before I ask you some political economy question?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers for keeping the virtual webinar ball rolling while we cannot meet in person, but looking forward to resuming that when we can. And thanks to the ambassador and Dr. Khaled for their comments. I guess I'll kick things off just by saying that there is a broad consensus at my institute amongst the scholars, and one to which I agree with, that Gulf Arab states and the UAE in particular are in a process of consolidation at the moment and really jockeying for power and influence in what I think everyone hopes will be a post-coronavirus order, both on a regional level and an international level. And there are a couple of points that I would point toward as evidence of this move. The first has to do with local economics, a bit about what the ambassador and Khaled mentioned. The second has to do with the new administration here in Washington and some of the changes that has also forced in the region. And then finally, the regional tensions within the GCC that seem to be easing of sorts or reaching some type of consensus point. And finally, I'll just qualify my comments with a comment or two about economic statecraft that the UAE is involved in. So Going back to the first point, I think the economic challenges facing the UAE are very significant and worth mentioning. We can get into them in more detail. But there's no doubt that the economic situation facing the country has required policymakers to turn a lot of focus and attention inward to address domestic issues. And part of that process is reassessing the costs and benefits associated with being involved in long-term, expensive external conflicts, both from the point of view of financial resources, but also reputational issues as well. I will point to one economic issue that is particularly worrying at the moment, and that has to do with the population contractions in the UAE. Some figures came out, estimates to this respect for 2020, and we saw that Dubai had a contraction in the population by about 8.4%. Abu Dhabi had around 5%, which was less than Dubai, but still higher than the 4% average across the GCC. And we heard a lot about double whammies in 2020 with the coronavirus and oil price rout, but population contractions are also a double whammy in the region, especially in places like the UAE, because on the one hand, they're symptomatic of challenging economic situations, but they also in and of themselves breed new challenges related to government-led service provision and the ability of the government to generate revenue, specifically in those governments outside of Abu Dhabi that do not depend on hydrocarbon exports. So that's the first point. The second point, I'm sitting here in Washington, or at least nearby, and of course there's a new administration in town. This is, I believe, forcing many Gulf Arab states like the UAE to reconsider and reassess their involvement in a number of different conflicts across the region. As the previous speakers mentioned, the UAE has already made a number of moves to draw down their involvement in places like Libya and Yemen well before the Biden administration came to power. I think that was a good decision and has probably helped them in their early engagements with the Biden administration. Of course, then the UAE also garnered an incredible amount of goodwill here in Washington and in Europe and elsewhere through their normalization agreements with Israel. I mean, largely, especially in Washington, it's largely been a positive development and will help them in terms of their diplomatic maneuvering. And finally, I don't think we touched upon this yet, but some of the other speakers might have more details than I have. There also has been a shakeup in the UAE, which brought new, not shakeup, but a reshuffling in the government, which brought new individuals to the fore of foreign affairs and diplomacy portfolios. So that signals some prospects for potentially moving in new directions, or at least more maneuverability in these areas. The third point I would say is that regional relations within the GCC have been very strained for the past 3+ years. And there is indications of an easing of tensions, an uneasy Gulf reconciliation, we could call it. And I attributed that to the realization amongst key parties that they had really reached the point of diminishing returns, at least on an economic and commercial point of view. And there really wasn't, there were very few reasons to continue the very strict boycott on Qatar, at least from an economic point of view. But I don't think that means that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are the best of friends and have moved completely to the other spectrum of economic integration and complete cooperation and alignment. We've seen a number of examples instead that these countries are aggressively pursuing national interests, and in some cases those national interests have either have or may have indirect consequences upon neighboring states. And I think the Saudi announcement about a policy coming into effect in 2024, which would require foreign firms to have a regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia in order to be eligible for government contracts, is a good example of that. I don't think it is a direct commercial challenge, but certainly could have indirect commercial implications on the UAE. And so those are the three main points I want to mention. There is, of course, a qualification here. I'm not saying the UAE is entirely focused inward. Of course, the ambassador and Dr. Khaled mentioned good examples of to say that it's not entirely looking inward. Even if we look in the commercial sphere, there are a number of different ways that the UAE can still advance many of its foreign policy agendas while also accomplishing economic goals. DP World, and other major government-related entities in the UAE continue to operate across the world in very strategic locations like the Red Sea, for example, through port developments and other types of free zone projects. And then you have the upcoming Dubai Expo as well, which is going to be a difficult event to pull off because of the coronavirus. It was already delayed a year. But even if we don't see 25 million visitors coming to the Expo as was hoped, it'll still be an opportunity for government officials to strengthen relationships with a number of different private sector and public sector actors over the course of late this year and into the following year. So I'll leave it there, but happy to continue the conversation in a bunch of other directions. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Going on with the economic dimension, my particular interest is on the last year's discovery of huge gas reserves. Do you think that Abu Dhabi can commercialize this asset? Okay, we are living through pandemic times and we need less and less of energy, but these times will be gone, and perhaps this will definitely provide Abu Dhabi a leverage, not only in economic terms, but also in political terms. So what's your take on this?
You'd like me to tackle that question first?
No, go ahead. And then I will ask the same question to Al-MEZAINI.
Sure, I'm happy to let Dr. Khaled go first if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. If I understood your question clearly, is in regards to the changes that have happened last year in 2020? Is that what?
So discovery of huge gas reserves, trillions of cubic feet. Yes. Does the UAE have any kind of policy in terms of commercialization, in terms of extracting and marketing these huge reserves so as to boost its economic and political leverage in the region? Perhaps it's a very specific question, but it drew my particular interest, so I just interfered. So sorry.
Thank you, Esra. I mean, if you refer to the field that was discovered in the borders between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the gas field, which is expected to contribute significantly to the federal budget and the local budgets of the Emirate of Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Remember that this is a shared oil gas field between the two Emirates. And I think looking at the economic dimension and perspective of UAE, the last 2 years have been difficult for the UAE in my own perspective. And I think UAE is working significantly to diversify its economy not to rely on oil. It has experienced the decline of oil prices. And even with the discovery of this new oil field, I think the government does not want to depend on it, because they know that oil prices in couple months. Even yesterday, we've seen a 5% increase of oil, which encourages the government to spend more. I think the government was exhausted by the financial expenditure on the operation in Yemen, and this is maybe costing the government to really think more in the long term. Of course, after 5 years, the spending in Yemen has been huge. Even if we look at the activities of foreign aid have been declined to some extent, because oil prices going down, you are playing a role in Yemen and in Libya. This is negatively affecting the economic activities, the financial responsibilities of the government. So this might help, this new discovery might help the government to overcome some of these challenges that it has faced in the last couple of years, to come back maybe in a different shape. And we've seen what also Robert have discussed, some of the changes during this the past 2 months that the government changing some of its regional policies. Why? Because I think also there is, not only because Biden is in power now and things, but also there is an economic dimension that you know, we should not really underestimate, because it might be in some cases the most important factor that puts pressure on states in the Gulf to make some changes. So I hope that I have been able to answer the question.
Definitely.
Maybe Robert has more things.
Definitely, thank you. Robert, would you like to add something?
Sure. I actually just recently completed a book chapter on the potential for privatizing natural gas assets in the Gulf. And I think the discovery in the UAE certainly in and of itself is not a negative development, but I guess the question is, how useful is it going to be for these governments, and how much, I mean, there's going to be a significant amount of investment needed to bring those resources online. And the question is, how much stomach is there to do that for these gas reserves? I mean, on the one hand, the UAE receives exports, Qatari natural gas exports via a pipeline, the Dolphin pipeline, and there is substantial room that the volumes that move through that pipeline there's room for them to be expanded. It's a relatively efficient and cost-effective way of receiving natural gas from a neighboring state. Certainly more cost-effective than the investments that would be required to produce the levels needed in the UAE at the moment. But the UAE also sees a very justifiable reason to move towards self-sufficiency in natural gas. They have had disagreements and rifts with Qatar in the past, and natural gas imports are critical for desalination, for electricity generation, for industrial processes. So I mean, there's a very good argument to be made that self-sufficiency is an important goal, even if it's not the most cost-effective one. It remains to be seen how the government will move forward with these natural gas reserves. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company did manage to privatize or sell a 49% stake in its natural gas pipelines. But those are existing gas infrastructure. It's already operating. It has a proven cash flow. And there was real demand amongst international investors for those natural gas assets. When you're looking at the proven reserves, that's at a different stage of development, and investors are going to be asking, is natural gas, which is largely considered right now a bridge energy source from kind of dirtier coal and oil to the cleaner renewable energies like solar and wind, how long is that asset going to be valuable, and how much can we cash in on that? So that's a gamble that they're going to have to take if they really invest and dive deep into natural gas.
Okay, thank you so much.
May I add something?
Please,
Yes.
please.
Well, about gas, I was trying to focus on bilateral things, but gas is very important. Almost a year ago, maybe just before this conflict, I was with two Greek Cypriot gas experts. They say that it's very difficult to find new investors in the gas fields because the demand on gas is diminishing, and people are focusing on renewable energy. Now, thinking about this, and on the other hand, it's not related, but it is related. Turkey and Emirati, well, how should I say, diffusing the conflict, they should come together, if you ask me. And the Emirates, in spite of investing in the gas, new gas fields, extracting the gas, why they don't come and diversify as their policy to invest certain fields in Turkey, mainly in agricultural, for instance. So they will make, through their investments, they will make in Turkey, they will make their country self-sufficient in foodstuff. The second thing is, which might ease the tension, is why Turkey, which has experience in that field, cooperates with Emirates to rebuild Yemen and help the people to elevate their living. These are the fields which they should invest more than verbal tirades and this and that. I mean, this is something in which they should focus, if you ask me, those two fields. The third thing, which you would know, but most people would not know, how should I say, the relations with Israel. Behind the doors, our trade is expanding with Israel. That's one, yes. Secondly, we have very intensive military cooperation in hardware with Israel, which I'm not going to in details. I don't want to be in trouble. Thirdly, we have a close intelligence exchange, high-level intelligence exchange with Israel. Thirdly, it was Turkey which brought Israel into Azerbaijan, introduced Azerbaijan. So you should not put all your own, you should not put your chips on the conflict or friction with Israel. It will change in one day, 1 month, something like this. And the strong link is also through the Turkish Jews in Israel or the Turkish Jews in Turkey. So these are the two factors. Now, as I say, I agree with Mezrahi about 100% agree about the threat coming from Ikhwan Muslimin. I agree with him. And second thing is that if is Ikhwan Muslimin destabilize Saudi Arabia, it will be not the rest of the Arab world, but primarily it will be United Arab Emirates. That's why I agree with him. Well, thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would like to get back to you once again. What are the opportunities and risks do Qatar and Israel pose for the UAE's regional foreign policy agenda?
Okay, I guess I'll take the Israel point first, because the ambassador ended his remarks talking a bit about Israel. Well, as I said in the beginning, obviously the UAE-Israel normalizations did wonders for the UAE, at least its reputation here in Washington, in terms of reputation building and diplomatic outreach, and it's been there's been a genuine excitement surrounding that. I think now we're moving into the phase where we're getting beyond the kind of excitement and the euphoria, and people are going to start asking some more sober questions about what areas of this cooperation are likely to flourish, and what areas are probably were maybe over exaggerated and are not likely to lead to much. I think it's quite clear that there is a strong interest and active level of cooperation going on in the security realms. There's a strong demand for Israeli technologies in the Gulf. But beyond that, where are the other areas of cooperation going to take place? And is the UAE actually going to benefit from this in the same way that one can easily see a number of Israeli technology firms and investors, for example, benefiting from this access to not only the UAE, but the larger kind of as using the UAE as a gateway to the larger Gulf and Middle Eastern markets. I think it's still a bit early to say. We have seen a number of MOUs and strategic partnerships going across banking and finance. I mean, investments in entrepreneurs, logistics and free zones and trade and diamonds and commodities. So there's a lot going on. But the question is will the economic gains of this relationship be concentrated in amongst a small group of individuals and economic elites, investors, and a very narrow selection of industries, or is it going to be a broader, partnership with broader gains? One bit of evidence that might suggest a slightly more optimistic reading of that question is that we know now about 130,000 Israelis visited the UAE from mid-October until now, and I suspect that number might even be larger, and that's amid the coronavirus. Now, certainly that plays into the whole excitement of a new destination and nearby a Middle Eastern destination, and is a historic agreement, but that certainly has played a big role in propping up an industry, a tourism industry, not completely propping it up, but helping to support it at a very difficult time. And that's quite a substantial number as well. So there's a lot going on right now, and I think this is going to be an area to watch when it comes to the UAE and the relations between UAE and Israel. I think I'll leave it there. I mean, maybe some of the other speakers have more to say there, and we can circle back to Qatar if needed at a later time.
Sure. Dear Khaled, can we have your opinion on this?
Yes, I agree with Robert. With there has been a lot of excitement after the signing of the agreement that potentially there will be a lot of cooperation, particularly at the technological level. The two countries have already signed some agreement, but I think we don't want to rush into conclusion that the two states are super excited and they would like. I think they are testing the shores now. They are trying to understand both sides, the commitment from both sides in regards to the Abraham Accord. I think it's going to take slightly more time for the two countries to build more confidence and then continue. There are a lot of provisional kind of agreement between the two countries. We've seen some already, particularly in regards to businesses between the two sides. They are excited to sign, already signed also, but moving into more kind of more sophisticated, complicated technologies that Israel sells, for example. I think we might see it maybe in the longer term. There might be more of a security cooperation also, but still, we don't have to forget, that the two countries are hard about some of the security agreements, so we don't know what kind of this. So this is a common feature in the Middle East where it's difficult to predict these kind of agreement. They might announce that, but I think at this stage, commercial, technology, and maybe in the petrochemical also technologies, they might cooperate. But I think we should expect this to happen in the coming 6 months or 7 months, because we are only 6 months or 7 months since the signing of the agreement. So the two countries will take it easy. I think they will not rush into making more significant agreement without understanding how the future of this agreement will go on.
May I ask a question to Dr. Al-MEZAINI regarding relations with Israel? Would you say that there will be a rivalry in near future between Egypt and United Arab Emirates regarding relations with Israel? Because Emirates society is more open, and they are not biased. Whatever, even with with Iran, you have excellent relations with Iran, and there are 400,000 Iranians living in Dubai. You have no problem in spite of ups and downs. But with Egypt, there is a resentment among the Egyptian people. Well, if they see an Israeli or investment, there is a sort of tension. That's why I say that they will have more opportunity to invest in the Emirates or develop cultural, whatever relations then in Egypt, Egyptian society is more, let's say, conservative or biased in that sense. That's why I'm asking if there will be a sort of, because Egypt wants to, that's a big problem with Turkey also. Egypt wants to be the leader of the Arab world. So why they should let the Emirates to take the, you know, that seat? So that's why I'm asking. It's a bit provocative, but it's a reality, I should say.
May I, Esra?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, and I can see this comparison of, you know, maybe if you think about Egypt, why Egypt, for example, will have anything to say in regards to this agreement between UAE and Israel. The Egyptian society and the Emirati society, of course, they had in the past years of Arab nationalism, and remember that Arab nationalism was very strong in the it's one of the leading countries in Arab. So the society is still have a lot of influence from the past of this ideology. Of course, Arab nationalism also was strong in the UAE at some point, and especially towards the Palestinian cause. You know, one would say that, you know, there is more kind of support of the Palestinian from the Egyptian side. But this was very much, if we think about it, during the 1960s, 1970s. The UAE's relation with the Palestinian has been significant in terms of the supporting the economy and providing aid for the last 50 years. Going back to direct to the questions of what you have asked, I think there is no rivalry. I don't think this is going to create any kind of you know, competition between the two societies or the two countries in regards. UAE's relation with Israel, I think, has a different format. It is not a peace agreement. We have to know that. The agreement is a normalization, because UAE had not any, I mean, based on the interpretation of the government, what they say, UAE did not engage in any kind of a military confrontation with Israel. Egypt, in contrast, people have suffered from the military intervention or the role of Israel. Because of that, we see more support or more, I mean, significant part of the Egyptian society are sometimes against some of the governments, Egyptian government policies toward Israel, because they want to see more support. So why they have suffered in the 1967 and war and 1973. So there has been military. So there is a history that is deeply inside the Egyptian society, which translates into the current, what we see in the Egyptian. So this makes it different. And therefore they had the agreement and a peace in 1978, which then calmed things down, you know, but still people have not forgotten about the military confrontation, the people who lost their lives because of the Israeli attacks during the 1967 and 1973. So they know that this is the difference. UAE, I think, when it comes to the UAE, I think UAE did not have, what you would say, here it is Egyptian, because of their geographic proximity to Israel. UAE, there is, you know, a huge gap or the distance between them. And they see that, you know, one of the objectives that this can be a critical juncture, an important juncture in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which UAE has been promoting also in regard to what they call it in here, tolerance and the coexistence strategies. That, you know, it is very important that if we want to sit and resolve issues, I think the two parties always have to sit together and talk instead of going always in. Exactly the same with the Iranian, also, which I sometimes had in other workshop, where UAE and the Turkish and the Emiratis also, if they are in confrontation, they should also sit together and talk instead of bringing someone, a third party, to trying to mediate. I think many of the issues, what we see here in the region is that because there is lack of understanding and acceptance of coexistence, and which creates sometimes competition in the region. So I hope that I've been able to answer the question, but as I said, there is a historical dimension that plays and interprets some of the current perception of the Egyptian society towards the Israel and Palestine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, then the last question about the United States. So I would like to start with you, Mr. Ambassador. So what is your forecast about US-UAE relations during the Biden administration?
Well, the Emirati leadership has made the first steps to, let's say, to face the new administration, and the leadership, the Emirati leadership traditionally has a vision for future. So I think they will adjust their policies regarding to the, which we don't know, but we read Biden administration. Secondly, they have a card in their hands, the Emiratis. For instance, there is a large American military base in the Emirates, Tafra, and this base is very important strategically, and also Abu Dhabi ports are for replenishment of the U.S. Navy in the Gulf, and I don't think the Emiratis are pragmatic people. A, B, they're open. They're not conservative. They immediately find solution and adjust themselves. Look at, I mean, they're having excellent relations. Well, I shouldn't say excellent, but they have a dialogue with Iran as well. They adjust everything. So it's a balance. They have a balanced approach to the region, and I think they will survive. And why Biden administration should twist someone's arms? I don't think so. Maybe we should. You should direct this question to Washington, Maryland. They're closer to the foggy bottom than we are, and
Definitely.
they know the restructuring of the new foreign ministry. I mean, State Department. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, about 5 miles away here from my current location in the White House. Very briefly and in short, to my mind, the key recipe for UAE success, at least driving its foreign policy agenda here in Washington, will be to, on the one hand, stay under the radar, with the exception of promoting the UAE-Israel ties and everything that accompanies that portfolio. I think right now we're seeing an incredible amount of heat and pressure on Saudi Arabia. For a number of different reasons. There are a couple of reasons that do overlap and start to get a little bit closer to some of the regional activities that the UAE historically has been part of. So I do very much believe that many officials would be happy to avoid that limelight and have the heat be on Saudi Arabia for the time being. And they are in the position to see that type of pressure and respond to it accordingly, and not necessarily have to react to the pressure that the Saudis are getting right now from both the administration and Democrats and even Republicans as well in Congress. So that's on the one hand. And then the second is just, I think the biggest asset that the Emiratis can bring to the table is their behind the scenes work with the US government on a number of security related issues, and also regional issues, and being a pragmatic partner in the inevitable discussions and negotiations with Iran that are going to happen. So realizing that this is the two priorities for the Biden administration in the Middle East, broadly speaking, are Iran and Yemen. And being to the degree that the UAE can, and I think they are able to do so, to be a pragmatic, helpful partner for Washington and work together on those two portfolios, that will certainly be to the benefit of the Emiratis.
Thank you, Robert. So, Khaled, what is your opinion on that?
And I agree with the other two speakers, Mr. Ambassador and Dr. Robert, on that. However, also would like to emphasize on the fact that the inconsistency of US foreign policy toward the region because of the changes of administration, creating more kind of dilemmas for Gulf states. Now we've seen under Clinton and then Obama, and Bush's administration, on all of them, and even Trump, that sometimes many policies do not stay the same, and this is a problem. This has pushed the Gulf states and UAE in particular into more of a kind of hedging strategies, or strategic hedging approaches. They say that they have to diversify their security partners, and why? Because we've seen a clear example now, a shift from Trump into Biden. We've seen the last couple of weeks, Biden's administration changes policies toward the region, have pushed the UAE to reconsider and revisit some of its policies in the region, because they know that they have received significant support from the Trump's administration, and then a new administration comes, and then UAE has to consider looking at Plan B. And this is what all the Gulf states have been doing, that they have to have a Plan B, because they know that 4 years or maybe 8 years, and then things will change. This is costing, by the way, because when Trump decided to withdraw some of the troops and then bringing back to the region, strengthening a new security agreement or military cooperation, it's costing both sides, the US, the Americans, and the Gulf states. And UAE also have clearly understood, that whatever Biden's policies will be, UAE is ready to adopt and make some changes. However, we've seen UAE's approachment towards Russia and China to diversify some of this, purchase of some military equipment, because you've seen the F-35, the suspension of F-35 to the UAE and other agreements. So I think the new changes in the US are affecting the Gulf states in general, creating more difficulties. And even, for example, we've seen with Saudi Arabia that the Houthis roles and the missiles that have been targeted towards Saudi Arabia, the US administration did not take kind of a severe measure towards this. And this is creating a lot of questions for the Gulf states and UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular. Say that how can we respond to a changing US government that is sometimes responding to some issues in the region, but not responding to some, for example, in regards to the Yemen Houthis military activities toward Saudi Arabia. So there are many aspects that I think UAE also is reconsidering. We have seen in the last 2 weeks in particular, withdrawing from some areas in the region, particularly maybe in Horn of Africa. UAE is reconsidering, and I think trying to understand what Biden's vision towards the Middle East is. I think maybe we will see UAE coming back again to some of its roles in the region, maybe after 6 months, after understanding what Biden really is looking for in the region. There is a lot of lobbying happening, and therefore influencing the current US administration. We don't know who's going to win in this lobby war in Washington. It's really making things more difficult for many, say the role of ambassadors, role of think tanks, and so on. So hopefully it will be for the good of the region instead of creating further conflict.
Thank you, Khaled. Just one bonus question for you. Since you have raised the element of China, would you like to elaborate further when it comes to China and UAE relations? Because there's recent news that UAE is bent on co-producing the Sino vaccine. It has already become a regional hub out of which Chinese vaccines are being distributed to the region. And I hope that, especially when it comes to the UAE and its dreams of becoming a high-tech country, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence, I'm wondering whether China is contributing, to Abu Dhabi when it comes to, upgrading its infrastructure when it comes to digitalization.
I think UAE has adopted the health diplomacy in the last year and a half, and China has been one of the main partners in this health diplomacy through the Chinese vaccine in particular. I mean, if we look at the relations between UAE and China, even before COVID, the pivot towards Asia was a significant dimension of UAE's foreign policy, has strengthened the relation and led to the expanding of trade, cooperation, investment, UAE becoming an important destination for China, the Chinese investors, and also the tourism. This has built a trust between the two countries. And now we see that UAE is redistributing the Chinese vaccine, creating, to call it, if the correct term, the health diplomacy here. It's strengthening the role of UAE in the region, and also making the vaccine more available. It has already done through distributing the Chinese vaccine to many states in the region, by the way. UAE has purchased. It is part of UAE's foreign aid, by the way, if we look at the bigger picture. Using health, trying to distribute vaccine to as many countries as possible, despite some obstacles, when it comes to some of the regional issues. So I think there is an important development between the two countries, and China is trusting UAE's role to redistribute the vaccine across the region, and also beyond the region. We hope to see more from this, because at this current kind of time, this kind of diplomatic activities from UAE, I think is very much needed, because it has affected UAE's airline industry. The aviation has been tourism, travel, because as you know, UAE's or Dubai in particular relies on tourism, and many tourists come from the region, and therefore UAE is trying to help other states also indirectly to bring things to normal and visit also the UAE. So there is improving relations between China and further development of this relationship between China and UAE.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And Robert, would you like to comment on the Chinese dimension?
Ambassador, would you like to go first?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Me or?
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, please.
Well, I always look at China as they are trying to have their outreach in Europe. So it's not only confined to vaccine. By the way, I had 2 jabs of Chinese vaccine already, so I'm one of the lucky ones. That's why I'm happy. But they're very active in Europe. For instance, the One Belt, the Silk Road, they circumvent Turkey, and they bought the Greek port in Piraeus, and they Costco, and the former American American Secretary of State was furious. He went there. So China is another element which we cannot disregard. They are coming in a how should I say, in a planned way through Europe. So the conflict with the United States will not be confined to the Pacific, but also regionally in the region, as well as in the Atlantic, because of the Chinese outreach. So I don't have more to say, and we all rely on, even in Turkey, we start before the this pandemic, the Chinese tourists were coming to Turkey, but now they stopped. So China will be a major factor. It's more threat, if you ask me, in the long term than the Russian expansion. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert?
Sure. Yeah, beyond the health diplomacy that Khaled mentioned, and also the quite visible presence of Chinese tourists that both Khaled and the ambassador mentioned, and the even more obvious and long-standing demand in Asia, and specifically in China, for Gulf hydrocarbon commodities. I mean, those are all foundations, old and new, for this partnership. But I've also identified a number of other areas where there are growing linkages, and I think that as we move ahead in the coming months and years, they're just going to be bound to accelerate. Telecommunications, Huawei and other Chinese state-owned telecommunications and global technology firms are laying down a lot of the digital infrastructure and telecommunication services in the Gulf, and working with a number of smart city projects across the region. Renewable energy, I mean, China is a powerhouse in renewable energy. So if these states like the UAE are going to develop and advance renewable energy agendas, they're going to have to and want to work with China. New media platforms, space and satellite cooperation, and financial technologies and e-commerce. Some of the financial technologies were put in place in the UAE to make it easier for Chinese tourists. Now with a lot of those Chinese tourists not there, I think the local residents and investors and business people are looking at these different financial technologies and payment platforms and saying, hey, wait a minute, these are very interesting, convenient to use, potentially good investment, and also work into a number of state-led economic development agendas, like increasing the use of digital transactions. So I expect the digital Silk Road components of the relationship to accelerate in the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, all of you. It was truly a very insightful debate, and we are just on time for concluding remarks. If you have anything to add, a last message.
Pleasure to meet these two. I mean, first to you, and also to distinguished contributors. I hope to be in touch with them in future as well, with you as well.
The pleasure is with us. Thank you.
Thank you
So much. Thank you for your contributions, and thank you for the audience for being with us. Okay, then I'd like to stop here, and enjoy your weekend ahead, and stay safe.
Thank you very much.